Before Minneapolis, New York, Louisville, Atlanta, and Ferguson, there was Oakland. Oakland has always been a magnet for radicals. Its seemingly endemic poverty ripe for social activism and civil unrest. In the 19th century, longtime Oakland resident Jack London gave the city its first famous activists. It was the birthplace of the Black Panthers movement in the 1960s, and it was the base for the Hells Angels in the 1970s. It was also the scene of waves of protest after the death of Oscar Grant on a train platform in 2009. And it's also where the term Black Lives Matter was coined in 2013. Yet social turbulence is only a small part of what police have had to deal with. Illegal drugs spewed money and violence into the streets, contributing to crime statistics that are among the highest in the United States. Police saw themselves as involved in an us or them struggle, and they were determined to prevail, sometimes by any means necessary, provoking confrontations and creating a department culture that stood apart from the people they were supposed to protect. With 400,000 residents, the city of Oakland has long been a stage for conflict between its police force and parts of the community. The city had long been known as a stomping ground for radical activists, matched in their aggression by one of the most brutal police forces in the country. But the recent death of George Floyd in police custody nearly 2,000 miles away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, has spurred civil rights attorneys John Burris and Jim Chanin to continue to take a closer look at how policing is and has been done in Oakland. In 2000, when a 21-year-old named Delphine Allen alleged that police brought him to a remote location and beat him while he was in handcuffs, he described being dragged under a freeway overpass and hit repeatedly on the soles of his feet with police batons. The Riders case, as it came to be known, grew to include at least 119 plaintiffs, the vast majority of whom were people of color, all with similar complaints and stories of abuse. In 2003, the department paid nearly $11 million to settle more than 119 allegations that a group of corrupt Oakland police officers known as the Riders conducted false arrests, manufactured evidence, and brutalized suspects. Those victims were represented by Oakland civil rights attorney John Burris and Jim Chanin. The more lasting impact of the Riders case, however, is a legal and judicial marathon now in its 18th year that has required the intervention of a district court judge, 2 outside monitoring teams, a compliance director, 6 police chiefs, 4 mayors, and tens of millions of dollars in legal fees. The goal of it all has been to reinvent the police department to prevent another Riders case from ever happening again. An independent monitor stepped in to oversee wide-ranging departmental reforms. But the reforms flopped, so much so that in 2012, after the city paid out millions more to settle additional cases, the federal courts prepared to step back in. Oakland's cops, a legal advocate for victims of police abuse, said at the time, might just be the worst department in the country. Officer-involved shootings were frequent and often fatal. Complaints of shakedowns and unwarranted arrests were rampant and cost the city dearly. All told, from 2001 to 2011, Oakland paid some $57 million for claims, lawsuits, and settlements involving alleged misconduct by the Oakland Police Department. Not just the largest sum paid by any municipality in California, but more than double what San Francisco, with roughly twice the population, paid in the same time frame. The police force seemed broken, brutal beyond repair. Jim Chanin and John Burris have in the years since become the department's most vocal and strident watchdogs. As a part of the settlement, the city compelled the police to accept what's known as a consent decree, a bureaucratic purgatory during which the department had to implement a series of institutional changes to improve its policing tactics. Failure to do so would result in the OPD being placed into federal receivership, meaning the federal government would take over the city's police department. Change in the Oakland Police Department has been slow. For the past 18 years, a federal monitor has overseen efforts to reform the police as a part of the police misconduct case settlement. In 2016, Oakland voters created a non-elected volunteer citizen board to review police disciplinary cases and recommend policy changes. In this insider-exclusive Justice in America Network TV special edition, Oakland, California, a model of 21st century policing, our news team visits with John Burris at the law offices of John Burris and Jim Chanin, founder of the law offices of James B. Chanin, the Oakland's police chief, LeRonne Armstrong, and one of the original 2003 Riders case plaintiffs, Jameel Harriel, to explain how a close and constant monitored vigilance over the Oakland Police Department has and is still achieving meaningful reforms. As an example of those reforms, use of force between 2012 and 2017 dropped 75%. In 2017, there were 19,185 discretionary stops of African Americans. In 2018, there were just only 10,874 stops of African Americans. Officer-involved shootings and lawsuits for excessive force have also dramatically decreased. Oakland's stunning turnaround from paying $57 million in damages for excessive force or wrongful death between 2000 and 2010 to just $3 million in the last 5 years has been widely lauded in the local press. All of these achievements were accomplished with no compromise to officer safety and no causal increase in crime, and continue under the leadership of Oakland's police chief, LeRonne Armstrong. Through John Burris's and Jim Chanin's vision and guidance, their activism has become the model for citizens and police reform advocates nationwide and have received increased attention given the recent public focus and outcry about police practices in this nation. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Oakland, California. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Burris and Jim Chanin to the show. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So each one of you, tell our audience, John, a little bit about your law firm. What primary practice do you do?
Well, I have the law firm of John Burris law offices. I have two offices, one in Oakland and one in Los Angeles. And our primary work effort is around police misconduct cases. That's all what we really do. Occasionally we'll have some other matters, but for the most part we're looking at police cases, and we've done that throughout the state. And that's our primary emphasis, and has been my emphasis for many, many years. I am a former prosecutor and I did criminal defense work, but at the end of the day, maybe 30 years or so, I sort of emphasized police misconduct, and in many cases I've done with Jim down through the years, but my emphasis has been representing people who've been victimized by police in all kinds of capacities. You name it, I've been involved in it, whether it's death penalty, racial profiling, tasers, jail suicide, beating up, wherever it is, we've been involved in those kind of cases, and we continue to do so.
I'm Jim Chanin, law offices of Jim Chanin, James Chanin. Started doing civil rights when I first became a lawyer in 1977. And have been doing it ever since. Starting in the 80s, I started representing select police officers, mainly African American and women officers who were treated badly by their own department. But mainly it's been excessive force, wrongful death, police beatings, and still doing it today. We have a case right now, Salgado. He was shot in East Oakland. One day I'll think of retiring, but it's not today.
Yeah, they need you. You can't retire, neither one of you. Today we're here talking about the Riders case. Tell our audience a little bit of the history of what is the Riders case, why is it called the Riders case, and why is it still ongoing?
Well, this, for Jim and I, was singularly the most significant case we were in back in 2000. And it came about because we found out that the Oakland police officers were, in fact, really harassing African Americans. They were planting drugs on them. They were making false statements, etc. And many people went to jail who otherwise should not have gone to jail. So we decided, because of sort of the public demands, we instituted a lawsuit that's called the Riders. And of that lawsuit, we represented almost 120 people, all of whom had gone to jail or been beaten up and treated very poorly by OPD officers. And we decided, once we got this case, that we were going to make this case change things in OPD. And part of that was to put together a pattern and practice case, which is commonly referred to as with a consent decree, although we call ours a negotiated settlement agreement. And the real purpose of it was to hold the police department and to change the policies and the practices and the general orders that OPD had in place. And we did that with a monitor, an independent monitor, and we had the federal court that was supervising the case. And we really went about making significant changes within the department. Significant resistance, no question about it. But at the end of the day, we kept at it. And unfortunately, it's been 20 years or so that we have been working at it. And Jim and I have been there consistently ever since.
In 2012, neither one of you were satisfied with the way the negotiated settlement was going, right? And you sued, right? You sued the OPD, correct?
Well, it started, they paid us $5,000 a year and thought we were going to go away. And I talk about this when I teach the new recruits at OPD now, because they had a papier-mâché version of what a lawyer is. They thought, well, we just like money and we'll move on to the next case. But they didn't know who we really were, and they didn't know we lived in Oakland.
And you weren't going to go away.
And we didn't go away. So after 9 years of this, I went to Detroit. I saw how the Detroit police treated the same monitor we have here in Oakland. They came out and hugged them. They were happy to see them. It was everything that wasn't happening here. And I got on the plane, I put my head against the window, and I thought, you know what, this has got to stop. So we filed the receiver motion, which was to put OPD into receivership, which is a form of bankruptcy, and it would be run by the court rather than by the police department. And that case was settled. We got part of what we want, most of what we wanted, which is the monitor was created in 2003, but now a compliance director was added, and the compliance director had the power to hire and fire the police chief and demote the deputy chiefs, and to unilaterally force change on the department, whether they liked it or not. Before, they were like an umpire calling balls and strikes, but that wasn't enough, so we changed it.
Did you find that with the regular police officers in the street, you know, they're obviously knowing they're being supervised and watched more carefully. Do you find that they were doing their job better or worse? Did they have the attitude, wait, you know, if you're going to watch over me, I'm not going to do anything? What was...
Well, I would say in the early stages, maybe the first 10 years, they did not accept the role of the Riders Agreement, largely because the sergeants and lieutenants and captains did not. And to the extent that they function in a orderly process, they were not committed to it. And so the reason why we had such difficulty is that the line officers, that is the people who made the decision, who did the work, they were not committed to it. And there was internal resistance all the way through. And it probably wasn't until 2014, if you will, aside from the case, when we were able to get some real data, stop data, if you will, to evaluate whether or not there was real racial profiling taking place. And we were able to hire, I think Jim and I agreed upon this, we hired this psychologist from Stanford, Jennifer Eberhardt, and that's really the first sign we had that change could be made here, and that we were then in a position to bring about change. But initially, profound resistance. And the resistance, I think, was, as Jim mentioned, was they thought we were just here for the money. And so as a consequence of that, they didn't respect us. And they probably hated us too, because we both have been suing the department for many, many years. And so I think that there was that kind of resistance. But since then, I think that there's been more of acceptance that we actually are trying to improve the situation and not to the detriment of the individual officers.
Do you find that as a result, we hear a lot about quote-unquote generic civilian oversight committees working together with police departments, trying to make things better, okay? I've seen around the country that in many cities, these civilian oversight committees have been disbanded. They don't have investigative powers. They don't have subpoena powers. They cannot gain access to internal affairs files. Tell our audience how OPD, Oakland Police Department, and the relationship you have with the Police Commission is much better in terms of that. So you do have more power. You do have more authority to work together to make a better situation.
Well, I think that in the beginning, before there was a police commission, that we didn't have to deal with the politicians in Oakland. All we had to do was go to the judge, who was very sympathetic, and the judge would do pretty much what we wanted, because what we wanted was fair and reasonable. And the judge had similar beliefs to us. I'm talking about Thelton Henderson. And so we didn't have all the politics that are implicit in police review boards. The current police commission grew out of the frustration with us not getting compliance with the NSA, and they set up a very, very strong police commission, which basically is over the city manager. They have the choice of hiring and firing the chief. They have the choice of they do all the discipline, and the discipline is final. And those kinds of things are not usually the case with civilian review boards. Most of them are advisory. Most of them are just talk and don't have much power. But this one has a lot of power and has exercised that power. They fired the last police chief, for example.
You and I have covered other cases where police officers were fired because they shot someone. They used excessive force or whatever. Yet they were able to appeal that decision to a civilian civil service commission, right? And they got rehired.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, the last police chief. I think there's a lawsuit that I read that she's filing, okay? When you talk about you now have the power to hire and fire police chiefs and assistant chiefs and training sergeants and all that other sort of thing, does that stick?
It can stick, of course. That doesn't mean a person doesn't have rights. The fact that the police chief could be fired by the compliance officer or the mayor or the police commission, that's true. They do have that authority, but the person can claim that their due process rights were violated, and there's a whole other scheme for that. There's no question about that. But I would only say that the part that is most challenging here is that when we're talking about the union, and although we haven't had a lot of fights with the union here in Oakland down through the years, there's always this question about when you're stepping on their toes. And part of their toes is their rights, their remedial rights, their disciplinary rights, and their pay rights. All of these things they will go to the end of the mat for. So we have had to work around those issues. To some extent, we've had good working relationships with them. I don't think we could be in a position that we're in now if the union had at least acknowledged that some of the issues that we were talking about really were good for the department. That doesn't happen everywhere, because I'm involved in a lot of other cities, and unions fight tooth and nail for every little thing. That's not really the case here in Oakland, and I think that has been a big deal. Now, when we started this case, that wasn't true. They had union leaders who really hated us and would fight over every little thing that we were involved in. So, but I think we developed a better working relationship over time, because I think that our integrity has come forward, and you can see that we really are looking there. Now, we do have to deal with this civil service. I will tell you that now. The case that you're making reference to, Jim and I are involved in this case. This guy killed 2 people within a 7-month period. He should have been fired. But the city took him to, he exercised his rights to go to civil service, and the arbitrator ruled in his favor, and he got his job back. And he's on the department right now. That man should be prosecuted, period. But he wasn't.
So let's talk about another thing we hear across America, the issue of qualified immunity, okay? We hear that officers can't be sued, they can't be prosecuted because they're protected. Let's talk about how is that relative to Oakland Police Department?
But it's not true. Officers can be sued, even if they exist. Qualified immunity is a statute, is a law that that's been built into the system that basically says if an officer is acting in a reasonable way, then he is immune from prosecution. But I'm going to tell you, I have countless cases that I've had since qualified immunity has been present, and we've been involved in all those cases, and we went to the Ninth Circuit, to the Supreme Court, etc. It's just not true. But it is something that's there as a barrier that the police then use, and they do use it, and they can use it effectively, and they've been used against us. But at the end of the day, it is a tool that the police have to try to immunize themselves from it, but it hasn't precluded us from doing our work, because we're basically taking cases where police misconduct is evident and there's a factual dispute about it.
What's interesting about qualified immunity is there's no law that was passed by Congress. This is entirely judicially created. When I started, there was no qualified immunity, and the Supreme Court just manufactured it. In this case, Katz, who lived around here. And, they say, we don't want the courts to legislate. And only liberals legislate judicially. But this was not liberal, and it was legislated by the courts. They made it up, and it out of whole cloth. It did not exist for many years while we were lawyers, and then out of nowhere they made it up.
Right. Do you see over the last 18 years that you've been involved with monitoring the police and improving it, do you see the quality of the police officers on Oakland Police Department improving?
Well, I think so in Oakland. We've had a good record here. And I say that against the backdrop that there have been several scandals during this period of time. We had a sex scandal. We had a scandal where they were pulling the pants down of African-American men. We had that. We had a search warrant scandal. But all of that, when you look at it, it improved the department after that, because those issues raised those questions, and I think from that, remedial action was taking place. For me, the big issue that we see, the most significant, is fewer people are being stopped by OPD now. Black people, Mexican people now than before. We haven't gotten down completely to it, but we know that because of the method of searching and stopping, that we have reduced that significantly, and I think that's a concerted effort on the part of OPD, and I think that's been helpful. And I think we'll tell you, there have been very, very few deadly force shooting cases in the last 5 years, which is important.
The stops of African Americans is down 70% from 2017. And we both consider that one of our greatest accomplishments, that fewer African Americans are being stopped, fewer Latinos are being stopped. And there has been a tremendous decline in officer-involved shootings. But the biggest decline is the one that's occurred in both our offices. We don't get beat-up calls anymore. We used to get beat-up calls like every week, twice a week. John would get more than I did, but I got plenty. And people just said, that, like Mr. Harriel, for example, he was in the writer's case, but 2-3 years later, he was standing on the corner, and he can tell you about it. He was beaten up for no reason. We don't get those cases anymore. They don't beat up and brag about it in the locker room. If a police officer bragged about beating up an African American or a Latino in the locker room, they'd be turned in now. And that's a big change in the culture, and one that we're particularly proud of.
I understand we have the new chief of police of Oakland with us, Chief Armstrong, so let's bring him on right now. It's my great pleasure to introduce Chief Armstrong to the show. Welcome to the show, Chief.
Glad for having me.
So you've been on the job now, what, about 3 months?
Yeah, just a little under 3 months.
But you've been with the police force in Oakland for many, many years.
Yes, over 22 years.
How have you seen the police force change over these 22 years?
Oh, it's changed significantly over the last 22 years. To come from a department that had very little oversight, very draconian policies, to be in a police department that now has civilian oversight, to have a police department that has federal oversight, to have a department that is now accountable to the federal judge. And so there are many changes that have happened over many years. I really believe that it's improved policing in the city of Oakland. I believe that reform has started in this police department, and I think a lot of what we're doing you will see is progressive. I believe progressive, but it actually leads to more positive outcomes. It means that more people that are having interactions with police officers are not, subject to use of force, particularly lethal force. And so I think we have clear checks and balances that exist in the department when the officers do use force. And so I think all of those things matter.
If we were to go outside in the streets and ask the common everyday person, how do you think the police, what kind of job do you think they're doing? What do you think their remarks would be?
I think you'll get a mixed opinion. I think that in some areas in the city, people might feel like they are supportive of police. They would say that they don't have enough police and they don't see enough presence from police. But then I think there are clear areas in the city that still have very low trust levels in law enforcement, still don't trust police.
You know, we've seen in the news recently with the Derek Chauvin case and a variety of other shootings around the country, and I'll bring up Chauvin as an example. Here's a police officer that had 22 complaints over his 19 years on the force, and yet nothing really, I think 3 of them he might have had a write-up on. All the rest were dismissed. Because your police department now has been under supervision of the federal judge right now, right? For the last 18 years. How do you select your officers today, and how do you keep them in check?
Well, there's a couple things that we do. During our background process, we do a thorough and comprehensive background to try to understand what type of officer we're hiring. And then during the training process, we go through all of the things that we have learned over many years, and including having our plaintiffs' attorneys, Jim Chanin, come in and actually teach a course to our officers about the history of the department and why we were even under a negotiated settlement agreement. And I think it's important that that's put in the context. I think sometimes officers don't understand the progress that we've made and how we ended up in this place where we see ourselves today with so much oversight. But I think also when you write policy that is clear, that you have leadership that's willing to hold people accountable, and when you have an external body ensuring that officers are following policy, making sure that the leadership is making the right decisions when it comes to holding officers accountable, I think that matters.
Today, when you have an officer, let's say, of the caliber of Chauvin, as John and I covered in another case, sometimes an officer is fired, terminated. But do you remember the case where the officer then petitioned the Civilian Review Board, right? Civil Service Commission, and he was reinstated. How is that prevented today?
Well, I don't think that you can prevent due process, right? I think there's an arbitration process that exists in due process that if an independent arbitrator decides that the officer is going to return to duty, then that officer will return to duty because it's binding arbitration. But I think it's the processes that we follow leading up to that. Are we doing comprehensive internal investigations that are being transparent and holding the officer accountable? Are we using our disciplinary processes properly, where the chief of police is examining all of the factors in the case and making the right decision? I think what we've seen in the George Floyd situation is that we all know wrong when we see it. And I think it's up to law enforcement leaders to make the right decision in the face of clear misconduct. And so I think when we stand by what we see is clearly in violation of our policies and make the right decision, I think you'll see more officers be removed from law enforcement because we have the courage to say they no longer should wear a badge.
Do you have a lot of people now who want to be police officers in the Oakland Police Department?
We've seen an increase lately, and that's because I've really focused on a grassroots effort to try to identify those in our community that are looking to have a career in law enforcement, that want to be a part of change and reform. I think a lot of people, as they look at law enforcement and the issues that are happening across the country, have decided that that's not a profession or career I'd like to go into. But I do think that there are people out there that would like to see a different police department, want to see policing done differently, and I think that they have the makeup to do it. And so we've been encouraging those locally and nationally. If you're willing to step up to the challenge, we welcome you. And I think there are some good people that will step up to the challenge.
You often hear this term, code of silence. Cops don't want to get their fellow cops in trouble. How do you deal with that?
You seek to create a culture within an organization that questions each officer's values, each officer's integrity and commitment to the organization and the community that they have sworn to serve. The oath is to be truthful. The oath is to be transparent. And the oath is to not turn your eye to misconduct. As officers go out every day and make decisions to enforce the law in the public, we also have to be able to hold ourselves accountable to the highest standards. And so that's what I'm pushing my officers. It's not about any one individual officer. It is about the policies and procedures that govern us and the authority that's been given to us, that we have to be willing to make tough decisions. And in some cases, we have to be willing to say that someone shouldn't be a police officer anymore, even if it's our colleague.
Now, John, 3 years ago, there was a police commission established here in the city between the Oakland Police Department and civilians. And prior to the time, there was a civilian review board, I believe, right? How has that worked effectively in making sure that the police department maintains all the lofty ideals that we all want them to use?
Well, surprisingly, there's been a real spirit of cooperation by the police command staff and their operative individuals with the police commission. So there's been new ideas, new approaches that the police commission had wanted, and they brought them back to the police department, and they worked through them in a philosophical way and intellectual way and reached a conclusion.
Now, let me ask you this question, because we've looked at civilian oversight, the generic term, in different cities in Albuquerque, Detroit, New York, various other cities where they eventually have been disbanded. And one of the reasons is because they had no investigative powers, they had no subpoena powers, they didn't have access to internal affairs files. In Oakland, that's not the case, is it?
I will say that the issues that you raised have historically been the issues in Oakland as well. But they've kind of worked through them with the police commission, where the police commission has a lot more authority and a lot more power. And they have an investigative unit themselves. The question now, though, is what happens with the internal affairs section of the police department, and whether or not those two can work together so that you don't duplicate the work. But I must admit, there's a real effort on the part of the police commission and the police department to try to iron out those details. But they're philosophical, and they'll have to work their way through it. But I think they're on the verge of putting forth something that's good. Now, the police union has not been an obstacle to any of this. That's the most important part about it.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Jim Chanin to the show. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Hi.
You became a lawyer in 1977, but prior to that time, you were working with the Berkeley Police Commission, was it?
Yes.
In trying to reform police methods at that time, correct?
I moved to Oakland in 1980,
Yeah.
but before that I was on the Berkeley Police Review Board from 1973 to 77 and from 1979 to 80.
So you've had a whole lifetime of looking at how police departments and civilian oversight committees try to work together, correct?
Correct.
Chief Armstrong, we often hear about police, you're in a police union, everybody's in a police union. How do you maintain the esprit de corps with your officers when it seems to them that they're being questioned every time there's a skirmish in the street or a shooting or whatever?
You know, I've said to my officers that we are living in the age of social media, where everything that we do is videotaped, and so you can expect for people to have an opinion, to put meaning to what they see. So it's even more important that every day that we go out there, that we are professional, that we're treating people with dignity and respect, and that we're following our own policies. And so really saying to people that while people do pay attention to the negative videos that they see, there are a small group of people that pay attention to the small, positive videos that they see, right? And asking everybody every day, what we have is this mantra of making deposits is what we call it. Every day is an opportunity to make a positive impact on community. And if we can make deposits every day, when something negative happens, at least people will give us a chance to actually tell our side, to be able to actually listen and have dialogue. And so I think that's what's important, and they understand that.
Give me an example of one of your police officers making a positive contribution to the community, something recently that happened.
Yeah, recently we had a young woman that was at a Target in our city, and she was suffering from some type of breathing, inability to breathe. Our officer responded and assessed her and talked her through that process, but eventually it got worse. The officer didn't wait for the ambulance to actually show up before he went into action and began to perform CPR on her. Because of the officer's quick thoughts and quick response to her medical situation, community saw an officer go in, and a woman that was now unconscious was brought back to consciousness because of the officer's actions. And so I think those type of examples really show community that police officers do more than just what they see in videos, do more than be involved in lethal encounters, that the vast majority of our job every day is to life-saving responses to things.
We often hear the term that some officers don't know how to de-escalate a situation. What do you tell your officers about de-escalation so that it avoids a bigger problem?
We not only talk about de-escalation, we included that in our use of force policy, the mandate to de-escalate. And so it is a practice that we consider to be a part of our use of force continuum, how we determine how we're going to address the situation. We also include that in every training that we do. We start off with de-escalation. And so that's so important to us because it starts with communication. I think that's where de-escalation really starts, from assessment and communicating with someone to assess what is their needs, and then trying to minimize the need to use force. And so not going in with the idea that this is going to be a force encounter, but going in with the idea that is there a way for me to de-escalate this situation and minimize the need to use force? That is the basis of all of our force-related training now.
You know, there's no question about being a police officer today, especially when you mention social media. This is a tough job. And there's a lot of challenges. Everybody's watching. Everybody's got a cell phone. And it's a job I wouldn't want. And I thank you, and I thank 99% of all the police officers out there for protecting us. Because, you know, bottom line is, without the police, you got chaos, right? So over a period of time, police officer goes to work every day, and he sees a lot of bad things, right? My question is, how do you, let's say, give a pep talk or give encouragement to officers to try and think positive about many of the people that are on the streets today, for example, that have mental problems? How do you deal with it?
Well, I think you try to encourage your officers by sharing what most community members feel, which is that they appreciate their service. I think that's important for them to hear, because every day you go out there and this can be a thankless job. I think it's also our opportunity as law enforcement leaders to recognize that there's a need for health and wellness for police officers as well, to acknowledge that there are times that this can become very challenging because of the negative environment that you have to work in. So investing in clinical psychologists to be available for officers to decompress, to talk about their experiences, and to get these things off their chest so that they don't carry them into the field. What we want to do at the Oakland Police Department is not only put police officers on the streets, but we want to put our police officers that are in the right state of mind. And this helps with that, because this is a very stressful job and very difficult job. But I'm so happy and delighted to lead a police department that is willing to have these conversations about what's impacting them and how these interactions are making them feel. And so that's what I'm really pushing to our officers, to be open to actually talking to someone, talking to professionals, debriefing about situations that had an impact on them, and figuring out how we can get past those things so that they can be in the right state of mind to serve their community.
Chief, let me ask your opinion about, we hear the term excessive force, and oftentimes in defense of somebody who responds to a bad situation, an officer will say, I use reasonable force. What do these terms mean on the street every day to your office?
Well, it means the force necessary to overcome the resistance, whatever resistance that you might be facing, but it needs to be proportional, right? That you have to use the force that's going to actually reach the outcome you're looking at, but it has to be proportional to the resistance that you're facing. If someone is literally pulling away, I wouldn't want to use a force option that might cause a significant injury to that person, because that wouldn't be proportional to the resistance. And so really, but this training, I think, again, is directly connected to de-escalation, right? It's the understanding of what proportional means, what's the appropriate amount of force depending on the resistance, but also once you achieve compliance, how do you de-escalate that situation and step back? How do you begin to dial it back, right, when you get the compliance that you are seeking? And so that comes through training, that comes through repetition, that comes through putting officers through stress-related training so that they can better understand what that looks like in practice. And that's what we're doing here.
Jim, again, ever since 1973 and after, you have been working with police departments, trying to make them more accountable and working together with the community. I grew up, as I think I mentioned to you, in a small town with 1,500 people. Cops knew everybody. No one ever shot anybody. It was unheard of, right? But today there's a lot of dangerous weapons on the street that, as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't be on the street, right? And police officers are faced with terrible challenges and decisions they have to make in a split second. How have you seen the Oakland Police Department with Chief Armstrong making progress in terms of making it a more workable situation for civilians as well as the police officers?
Well, I'm hopeful that he will be the last chief in the NSA. We've gone on now for 20 years, 17 years in the agreement itself and 20 years in the case. It's time to let the Oakland Police run themselves. And as soon as I can be convinced that happens, then we're going to leave. And I want to be convinced, and I believe this guy here is going to make it happen and already has started making it happen. We're very hopeful that we are reaching the point where we can step back and let the police do their job without oversight from us and the monitor.
In the short time that we've been speaking, I'm very impressed with you. This is a tough job. I don't know a whole lot of people who would want the job because it isn't the traditional police chief job, because as I mentioned to you, growing up in a small town, bottom line is everybody knows everybody. We have bigger cities. We got a lot more people today. but you still have to be in touch with the local citizenry.
Some
Right?
of his predecessors, I didn't think there was any way it was going to happen. So it's a real compliment and a well-deserved one that I think it can happen with him.
Yeah, I got to ask the main question, which is, do you see working with the community and the police commission and civilians, do you see crime going down?
Yeah, I think that really is the key to crime going down. I think for many years, police departments have used a strategy that's centered around arresting people as the result of crime reduction. I tend to see things a bit different. I think the best way to reduce crime is to actually get people to not actually engage in criminal activity. And that means that you have to engage with community. You have to engage with other support agencies that can help people make better decisions. That's the sort of method of crime reduction that I use. Now, there's a piece of enforcement. It's important that people understand that if they come into our city and commit a violent crime or they're involved in criminal activity, that we are going to enforce the law. But what's also important is that prevention side and the intervention side. Prevention meaning, are we working with community to say, hey, let's try to figure out what is driving people into crime and see if we can get them the support that they need. Let's talk about how we can intervene in conflicts, particularly group and gang conflicts that lead to multiple incidents of violence. Let's see if we can intervene in those conflicts and mediate those things, get those things to be resolved so that nobody has to lose their life. So it is a comprehensive approach that includes both law enforcement, but also violence intervention and community members. I think from that holistic perspective, that's how we reach a community that's safe. Now, I'm fortunate because being born and raised in Oakland, I have those relationships with community that I'm seen as a hometown guy, and that I'm able to have that sort of big city, little city feeling, because if you're from Oakland, most people say in Oakland, somebody knows somebody. There's always, we're very close to each other in terms of our connection throughout the city. And it's really been helpful for me because I think community is ready to be a part of the response to crime in the city, and they don't want to leave it to police alone. And that's why the police commission's oversight is so critical. It's because it actually brings their voice into our decision making. When I create policy now, I am bringing those policies before police commission and allowing community to actually have their input, to provide feedback and take that feedback seriously and incorporate it into policy in most cases.
Do you have any suggestions or ideas how the relationship between the police commission and the Oakland Police Department could be improved?
I think it's just to continue to work collaboratively, right? That there are going to be people that are anti-police, that no matter what we do, they're not going to be happy or satisfied. I think from my perspective, it's important that the police commission just remains neutral and knows that we are here to collaborate and improve policies that help improve public safety in the city of Oakland. And so as long as, we don't allow one group to control the conversation, an anti-police group that is not here to support public safety in a way in which we want to, which is collaboratively. And so I think if there's a balanced approach, I think that we can work together and we can come up with policy that works for us as a city that represents the values of the community and the police department.
Your input on that same question, Jim?
I basically agree with what he said. I think that the police commission is a big step along the way. In the right hands, it can be a valuable tool to restore faith in the police department. Chief Armstrong sits on top of a long history of bad behavior, which he's not responsible for, but it happened nevertheless. And that it's a big problem. I mean, my first experience with the Oakland police in 1967 was watching them beat everyone up in front of the draft board. And there are years and years I saw what happened to the Panthers. I know they did things too. I saw how they handled crowd control. There were people hired when I arrived here that were hired because they hated the city and hated the people and thought they had to beat people into submission. But that's not the case anymore. And I think we have many officers in OPD who are willing to work collaboratively, who want to work here because they like the people. and not because of what happened in the old days.
Well, this model seems to be working, and the rest of America needs to look at it and see how it works, why it works, and the positive aspects of it. And I want to thank you, Chief, because I know you have to go, for taking your time. It's a valuable time. Get back at your job. Hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Jameel Harriel to the show. Welcome to the show, Jameel.
How you doing?
Way back in the mid-'90s, you had an encounter, a number of encounters with the Oakland Police Department, and you were eventually part of one of the plaintiffs, I think it was 119 in the Riders case, that Jim and John represented these folks against the Oakland Police Department. Tell our audience what happened to you in the mid-'90s and your experience with the Oakland Police Department.
Well, they was really out of control in the mid-'90s. One night I was just walking down the street. I guess it was a disturbance in the neighborhood with some gunshots. So I'm headed to the store, you know, and the police just came out of nowhere like a gung-ho cowboy, and he was like kind of over aggressive. Also, Officer Vasquez. And he was kind of like trying to control the area because of, I guess, the gunshots or whatever was going on. And he asked us our names. We gave him our IDs. And then he just like, kind of like manhandling me, choked me, like, you know. And then I kind of like was trying to like turn away so I won't, you know, really get hurt. And then they wrestled me onto the ground. I was kind of young then. I was like 20 years old. So I was kind of nervous being around police, and especially him toting weapons and just kind of overly aggressive. So long story short, they wrestled me to the ground. I gave him my ID. I was compliant with him, but I guess when he walked off, he put some drugs on me, and he said it was mine. You know, it was like, you know, it was him and a couple of them. So, you know, I had went to court for it, and I never had a police record or anything like that. And man, that was just a long, tragic little episode of my life dealing with the Oakland Police.
What were you taught by your parents about the Oakland Police Department?
I grew up in the church family, so, you know, like we didn't really get into too much trouble. So, you know, when you was a kid, it's kind of like the Boys in the Hood. When Trey was a kid, you kind of thought the police was good people. And then when you get older, it's this kind of like out the movie scene where he got older and that same cop like bashed him upside his head. So when you was younger, we had no fear of anything. It's like when you get to be a teenager or something, they just automatically want to just hurt you.
Since it's settled, have you seen the Oakland Police Department improve?
Yeah, they in the 90s, I think John Burris and Mr. Chanin did a great job of representing a lot of people. They the voice of the communities. Like everybody don't have that option to have someone that's respected and know what they're doing to have to voice them, because, you know, I was a kid. I tried to fight it on my own, but in the beginning, and then I came to Mr. Chanin for help, and that's how this thing got the ball rolling. But you know, so you it's kind of essential to every community to kind of have a Jim Chanin and John Burris.
So when you see a police officer today, do you see them as better people today?
Because I'm not the judge of anyone, of their good or bad, you know. But I do know that a big difference have been made of how they approach people just walking up and down the street. You know, back in those days, they just jump out the car and beat the hell out you, and then take you somewhere else and beat the hell out you some more. Versus nowadays, they so much do their dirty work on someone in the vehicle, or like they'll catch you in a kind of like a compromising position, and then they'll do so much of the police misconduct. There's still a lot of work to do, but I see a big change.
Jameel, I want to thank you very much for taking your time, your valuable time being on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, parting words in your association, in oversight of the Oakland Police Department, what do you see that this city and the Oakland Police Department can do better? And what is your message to other cities and police departments out there about modeling your success rate here and adapting it to their city?
Well, I will tell you, I don't know that everyone would see it as a success rate because it's taken 18, 20 years, okay? However, if they would go behind it and look, they will see that there's real success. What I would say, and I always say this, it requires political leadership. You got to have the people in the city, the political people in the city, the mayor, the city manager, the police chief, and the command staff willing to investigate and look into issues of accountability, transparency, and you're holding people accountable. If you're prepared to do that, you can bring about change and have imagination. You got to have an imagination about how to get things done and how you can improve the quality of policing. You cannot bury your head in the sand and just assume that what the police said happened really is true, because often it is not. And that's the problem that I think has to be faced. You got to be willing to be looking at yourself closely to determine whether or not that there's real value and truthfulness in what's being said. If not, then it won't change.
And I just want to echo what John said. I think political will is critical. Not every city can have two lawyers battling for 20 years. In the beginning, we had no political will in Oakland, and so we went to a court. Nowadays, with George Floyd and the body-worn cameras and people having phones, I think there's more chance of getting political will for no other reason than self-interest. And maybe that can mature into really being convinced that this is better for a police department not to be in the headlines for the bad things they do, but be in the headlines for the good things they do.
Yeah. One last question, because you brought it up, to both of you. In North Carolina recently, there was a guy that was executed, for lack of a better term, 5 police officers. There is body cam that is unavailable to the public. So this is the question. You're both civil rights lawyers. How soon should that body camera be available to the public and to the attorney representing the client who's deceased?
Yeah, I'm involved in a number of cases still pending like this. And I believe that the videos should be available to the lawyer and the family immediately. Whether it should be released to the general population, to me, that's another question of the investigation per se. I think that there's some value there, because if you release it and you haven't completed it in any kind of thorough way, it may be that some other people's testimony might be affected by having seen it and therefore have credibility questions. I'm not certain that that's always true, but it doesn't bother me that it's held out for a reasonable period of time. That could be 30 days, 45 days. California is 45 days.
But the family and the lawyer have to get it
Immediately.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
And I think what John raises are legitimate issues about tainting witness testimony. But certainly, if that's not a factor, then it should be released.
Openness is important. I think what we're really saying is that police should not have the authority, given that they're public servants, they're getting paid with public dollars, and they're involved in the public's business, that is, people in the community. They should not have special privileges for privacy. The work that they do should become public as soon as it's available, and should not have a certain level of privacy just because they're police officers. In fact, they should not have that kind of privacy. Their personal life, that's different, obviously. But their work history as a public servant is public, should be public.
Well, I want to thank you both for spending time with us today. Your insight and what you've accomplished is very admirable, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.